In today's video, we delve into some of the most chilling and unimaginable true crime stories. These are the cases of teenagers who killed their own families and lived to tell the tale, pretending to be innocent while hiding dark, deadly secrets. Stay with us as we uncover the disturbing truth behind these shocking murders and the deception that followed. The Elkmont Tragedy. Elkmont, Alabama, was the kind of town where people didn't lock their doors. Neighbors exchanged warm smiles, and families lived out their days in quiet normalcy. It was the last place anyone would expect to witness a massacre. Yet, on a cool September night in 2019, horror descended upon one unsuspecting household. The boy was only 14. He wasn't the type you'd expect to harbor dark thoughts. At least that's what people like to believe. He had friends, went to school, and blended in. But something was brewing inside him. His mind had been whispering things, terrible, violent things, for weeks, maybe months. He had started researching, reading articles about murders, the perfect ways to kill, and how to fabricate innocence. He had even searched for how it felt to take a life. The gun was his father's. It was usually locked up, but carelessness had left it within reach. He had held it before, felt the cold steel against his skin, imagined pulling the trigger. The weight of it was intoxicating, power in his grip. He waited for the perfect moment, when the house was quiet, when the shadows stretched long and deep. His father was the first. He was asleep, unaware, helpless. The boy stood over him, his pulse hammering in his ears. For a second he hesitated. Then, with a sharp breath, he squeezed the trigger. The gunshot shattered the silence. Blood bloomed across the sheets. His stepmother woke up instantly. She stumbled out of bed, confusion painting her face. She barely had time to register the horror before he raised the gun again. Another shot. She crumpled to the floor. The sound had roused his younger siblings. Footsteps in the hallway. He turned, eyes empty, heart steady. They were small, easy targets. A squeeze of the trigger, then another, then another. The house was a tomb. The smell of gunpowder and blood hung thick in the air. He stood in the center of it all, surveying his work. A twisted masterpiece. Then came the next step, pretending. He had rehearsed this part in his head. He threw the gun into the woods behind the house and dialed 911, his voice trembling with carefully manufactured fear. "My family. They've been shot. Someone broke in." The police arrived in minutes. Blue and red lights flashed against the darkened windows, painting the walls in eerie shades. The officers found him outside, shaking, eyes wide with the perfect blend of terror and grief. He played his role well. For a while they believed him. But cracks began to show. His story wavered. Details didn't line up. The gun was missing, but there were no signs of forced entry. He hadn't planned for the inconsistencies, for the way detectives would pick apart his words. Hours later, under pressure, he confessed. The mask slipped. The innocent boy was gone. They took him away in handcuffs. His face was blank, unreadable. The town of Elkmont, once untouched by true horror, would never be the same. And in that house on Ridge Road, silence reigned once more, an echo of the lives that had been stolen. The Broken Boy of New Mexico. The night was quiet in the small town of Albuquerque, New Mexico, the kind of night where the wind barely whispered through the trees and the stars blinked lazily overhead. Inside a modest home on Dorado Place, a family of 5 lay sleeping, unaware that the youngest among them, 12-year-old Nehemiah Griego, was about to shatter their world forever. Nehemiah had always been different. At church, he was the quiet boy who rarely spoke. At home, he was obedient, polite. But in his mind, darkness festered. He had been thinking about death, about violence, about what it would feel like to pull the trigger and watch life slip away. It wasn't an impulse. It was a plan, That night he moved with a kind of cold efficiency. He had taken his father's .22 caliber rifle, one he had used before during hunting trips. There was no hesitation when he stepped into his parents' bedroom. His mother, Sarah, was the first. She lay curled beneath the blankets, breathing softly, lost in a peaceful dream. The rifle was steady in his hands. One shot, then another. The noise stirred his 9-year-old brother, Zephaniah. Confusion clouded the little boy's face as he wandered down the hall, drawn by the sound. He found his mother, blood staining the sheets, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Before he could scream, Nehemiah raised the rifle and fired. Zephaniah collapsed beside their mother, the life draining out of him. His 2 younger sisters, Jael and Angelina, were next, 5 years old, 2 years old, too young to understand, too young to escape. He walked into their room, heart pounding, mind blank, a single shot each. Then silence. But Nehemiah wasn't done. His father, Greg, was still alive, still out working at the local church, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding in his home. Nehemiah waited, pacing the blood-soaked house, running his fingers along the cool steel of the rifle. Hours passed. The clock ticked relentlessly toward the inevitable. When his father finally stepped through the door, Nehemiah was ready. The moment Greg Grigo turned the corner, Nehemiah opened fire. The force of the bullet slammed his father backward. He twitched, gasped. But he wasn't dead. He tried to crawl away, to reach for something, anything. Another shot, then another, and then it was over. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, was now a crypt. Nehemiah didn't panic. He didn't cry. He cleaned himself up, changed into fresh clothes, and packed a bag. Inside, he placed the rifle, some ammunition, and a carefully selected black hoodie. He wanted to make it to his next destination, the local Walmart. He had plans to continue the carnage. More blood, more bodies. But something stopped him. Instead of unleashing more violence, he went to his girlfriend's house. He told her about the murders, about the bodies lying cold in the home. She didn't believe him. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe he was just saying things. But when she pressed, his face didn't change. The darkness in his eyes didn't waver. She told her mother. Her mother told the police. By the time officers arrived at the Griego home, the boy had already woven his web of lies. At first, he claimed a stranger had broken in and slaughtered his family. He put on a mask of grief, shaking his head, pretending to be scared. But the details were off. The story twisted, unraveled. Under the weight of their questions, he finally admitted it. Yes, he had done it. Yes, he had killed them all. There was no remorse, no sorrow, just a cold, detached acceptance. Nehemiah Grigo was arrested that night. Investigators later discovered he had been obsessed with violent video games and had long fantasized about mass murder. The boy who once sat quietly in church, the son of a well-respected pastor, had transformed into a killer. His trial dragged on for years. Because he was only 12 at the time of the murders, his sentencing was complicated. In 2019, after multiple hearings, he was sentenced to serve until he was 21. The decision was met with outrage. A family had been wiped out, and yet many felt the punishment didn't fit the horror of his crimes. To this day, people still wonder, what created the monster inside Nehemiah Griego? Was it something deep and twisted in his soul, or was it something the world failed to see until it was too late? The ice-cold killer of St. John Street. Johns, Arizona was a town where nothing ever happened, a place where people left their doors unlocked and waved at passing cars. But on November 5, 2008, something happened that changed everything. A boy, only 8 years old, became one of the youngest killers in American history. The house on West 4th Street looked normal from the outside. Inside, it was a crime scene drenched in blood. The victims were 29-year-old Vincent Romero and his friend, 39-year-old Timothy Romans. And the murderer? Romero's own son. The boy had always been quiet, small for his age, with wide, innocent eyes. No one suspected the darkness lurking inside him, but something had snapped. Maybe it was the way his father disciplined him. Maybe it was the thoughts he had been harboring. Whatever it was, he had been planning this. The .22 caliber rifle was his. His father had given it to him, wanting to teach him responsibility, hunting, survival. But the boy had different plans. He had watched enough, learned enough. And now he was ready. That afternoon he lay in wait, gripping the rifle with small but steady hands. He knew his father would be home soon. He knew exactly where to stand, how to aim. He had rehearsed it all in his head. When the door opened, his father barely had time to register what was happening before the first shot ripped through him. Vincent Romero staggered, gasping, clutching his chest. The pain, the betrayal. It must have been written all over his face. But the boy didn't flinch. He fired again and again. His father collapsed, his blood pooling across the floor. Then came Timothy Romans. He had heard the gunshots. He ran into the room, eyes wide, mouth open, maybe to scream, maybe to beg. It didn't matter. The boy lifted the rifle once more. Another shot. Another body hitting the ground. The house fell silent. Most killers panic. They try to cover their tracks, run, hide. But this boy? He simply walked outside. He sat on the porch, waiting, staring at the horizon as if nothing had happened. When the police arrived, they didn't know what to think. 2 dead men, no sign of a struggle, and an 8-year-old boy sitting there, calm. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for his father. He just looked up at the officers and said, "I shot them." The confession sent shock waves through the town. No one could comprehend it. An 8-year-old killing his own father, his father's best friend? The community reeled in disbelief. But the evidence was clear: the rifle, the casings, the boy's cold, matter-of-fact confession. He was arrested, questioned, processed like any other killer. But he wasn't like any other killer. He was just a child who had done the unthinkable. His trial became a media sensation. Could an 8-year-old truly understand murder? Should he be tried as an adult? Was he a monster, or was he a victim himself? The court wrestled with these questions, and in the end, a plea deal was struck. He would serve time in a juvenile facility until he was 18. To this day, the question remains: what went wrong? Was it an abusive home? Was it a mind born twisted? Or was it something else entirely, something darker, something even the boy himself couldn't explain? No one will ever know for sure. But in St. John's, Arizona, the ghost of that night still lingers, a chilling reminder that sometimes even the smallest hands can commit the darkest acts. The wolf in sheep's clothing, the Bever brothers, Massacre, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, was the kind of place where neighbors trusted one another. Families lived in quiet houses with neatly trimmed lawns, and nothing truly terrible ever seemed to happen. That illusion shattered on a warm July night in 2015 when 2 teenage brothers carried out one of the most brutal family massacres in American history. Robert Bever was 18. His younger brother, Michael, was 16. To outsiders, they were just quiet kids, homeschooled, reserved, and mostly kept to themselves. But behind closed doors, they were something else entirely. Robert, especially, was consumed with dark fantasies. He had spent months obsessing over mass killings, devouring articles and documentaries about serial killers. He idolized them, worshipped their brutality. And then, one day, he made a decision. He wouldn't just read about killers. He would become one. The plan wasn't spontaneous. It had been meticulously crafted, every detail sharpened to perfection. Robert and Michael didn't want to just kill. They wanted to be infamous. They had dreamt of becoming legends, their names whispered alongside the most notorious murderers in history. They planned to slaughter their entire family, escape, and go on a cross-country killing spree. In their minds, they would be unstoppable. The night of July 22, 2015, was suffocatingly still. Inside their home, their parents, David and April Bever, were unwinding after a long day. Their 5 younger siblings, ranging from 2 years old to 13, were scattered throughout the house, lost in their own worlds. None of them knew they were about to die. The boys struck just after nightfall. Robert, wielding a knife, made the first move. He attacked their 12-year-old brother, Daniel, stabbing him repeatedly. The screams filled the house, sharp and piercing, slicing through the silence like a blade. But there was no mercy. Michael joined in, his own knife slashing through the air, striking without hesitation. Their mother rushed toward the noise, panic flooding her face, but she never stood a chance. Robert turned on her, stabbing her over 40 times. The kitchen floor was slick with blood. Their father came next, barely able to fight back before the knives cut him down. The younger siblings tried to run. Their 13-year-old sister, Crystal, managed to dial 911 before Robert found her. He plunged the knife into her stomach, leaving her to bleed out. The youngest ones, mere toddlers, were easier. Small, defenseless. They didn't understand, didn't have time to be afraid. And then, silence. The house was a bloodbath. The massacre had taken less than 30 minutes. But something went wrong. Crystal, despite her injuries, survived. The 911 call she had made before being attacked had alerted the police. They arrived quickly, faster than the brothers had expected. Robert and Michael panicked. Their grand escape, their dream of becoming legendary killers, collapsed in an instant. They bolted out the back door, running into the dense woods behind the house. But they weren't as clever as they thought. The police tracked them easily, their footprints carving a path through the dirt. Within hours they were caught, dragged out of the darkness and thrown into the blinding light of reality. During questioning, Robert smiled. He boasted about what he had done, about how much he had enjoyed it. He told the officers he had originally planned to kill at least 100 people, maybe even more. He was fascinated with mass murder, and this was only supposed to be the beginning. Michael, however, was different. He was quieter, scared, less sure of himself. He had followed Robert blindly, convinced that what they were doing was right, convinced that they were meant for something bigger. But in the interrogation room, that illusion shattered. Robert was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Michael, being a minor, received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 38 years. The Bever house was abandoned after the murders, its walls forever stained with what had happened inside. Some say it was haunted, cursed. Eventually the city tore it down, replacing it with a memorial park. But the horror of that night still lingers in Broken Arrow. The town, once quiet and safe, will never forget the Bever brothers, the boys who turned their home into a slaughterhouse and dreamed of a legacy soaked in blood. The Medicine Hat Horror. When a 12-year-old became a murderer. The town of Medicine Hat, Alberta, was the kind of place where bad things simply didn't happen. People left their doors unlocked, children played outside without fear, and neighbors looked out for each other. But in April 2006, the small Canadian town became the site of an unimaginable crime, one so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it. It was a warm spring evening when the Richardson family's home fell silent. Inside, 3 bodies lay sprawled across different rooms, their lives violently stolen. The mother, Deborah, had been stabbed over a dozen times in a frenzied attack. The father, Mark, suffered a brutal onslaught of stab wounds, fighting until the very end. And their youngest 8-year-old Jacob had been nearly decapitated, his small body left in a pool of blood. The entire family had been wiped out, but one person was missing: 12-year-old Jasmine Richardson. At first, investigators feared she had been abducted. Her bedroom was undisturbed, her belongings untouched. A search party was formed, the town desperate to find her before it was too late. But the truth was far worse than anyone had imagined. Jasmine wasn't a victim. She was the killer. Or rather, she was half of a murderous duo. The town gasped in horror when they learned Jasmine had orchestrated the slaughter with her 23-year-old boyfriend, Jeremy Steinke. A man nearly twice her age, Jeremy was a self-proclaimed vampire who claimed he had lived for centuries. Dressed in gothic clothing, wearing dark eyeliner and trench coats, he was an outcast. And Jasmine, sweet, quiet, seemingly innocent Jasmine, had fallen for him completely. Her parents disapproved. Of course they did. What mother and father would let their 12-year-old daughter date a 23-year-old man who believed he was immortal? They tried to put a stop to it, forbidding her from seeing him. They thought they were protecting their child. They had no idea she was plotting their murders. Jasmine and Jeremy communicated online, sending chilling messages back and forth. In one, Jeremy told her he wanted to kill her parents so they could be together. She responded with a simple, haunting reply: "I love you. I think this is a good idea." And so, they planned. On the night of April 22nd, Jeremy crept into the Richardson home, a knife clutched in his gloved hand. He found Deborah first. The moment she saw him, she screamed, but it was already too late. The blade plunged into her again and again, her cries echoing through the house. Mark, hearing his wife's dying screams, charged down the stairs. He fought back, managing to stab Jeremy once before he was overpowered. But Jeremy had the advantage. He struck relentlessly, slashing, stabbing, until the man collapsed onto the floor, bleeding out beside his wife. Upstairs, Jasmine had a job to do. Little Jacob, only 8 years old, cowered in his bed crying. He had heard everything. He knew what was happening. When his sister entered the room, a knife in her trembling hands, he begged. "Why?" he sobbed. "Why are you doing this?" Jasmine didn't answer. Instead, she pressed the blade against his throat and dragged it across. The boy fought, weakly kicking at her, but the betrayal cut deeper than the knife ever could. His own sister, the person who should have protected him, was the one stealing his life away. When it was over, Jasmine and Jeremy ran. They fled into the night, convinced they would start a new life together, free from anyone who would keep them apart. But their fantasy was short-lived. The police caught them less than 24 hours later, hiding in a small town 80 miles away. When questioned, Jeremy bragged about the murders, claiming it was a vampire-style killing. Jasmine, on the other hand, barely showed emotion. When asked about Jacob, she simply shrugged and said, "I didn't want him to grow up without parents." The trial was a media sensation. Could a 12-year-old truly understand the depth of what she had done? Was she manipulated by Jeremy, or was she just as guilty? The court decided she was responsible. Jasmine became the youngest person in Canadian history to be convicted of multiple murders. She was sentenced to 10 years, the maximum sentence for a minor. Jeremy, the mastermind, was sentenced to life in prison. But here's the most terrifying part. Jasmine Richardson is free. After serving her time, she was released and given a new identity. She lives somewhere in Canada, blending in, a woman with a past drenched in blood. And no one, not her neighbors, not her co-workers, knows the truth. Medicine Hat will never forget what happened that night. The house where the Richardson family once lived was demolished, as if erasing it could erase the horror. But the memory remains, and the question still lingers. Does Jasmine Richardson feel remorse? Or does she walk among us, still carrying the darkness inside her? The Freeman brothers, a pact made in blood. The small town of Salisbury, Pennsylvania, had always been peaceful, the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and families gathered for quiet dinners. But on February 26, 1995, the Freeman household became a slaughterhouse. Inside, 3 bodies lay motionless: Dennis Freeman, his wife Brenda, and their youngest son Eric. The killers, their own flesh and blood. Brian Freeman, 17, and his younger brother David, 16, had never fit the mold of the obedient, clean-cut kids their devout Jehovah's Witness parents had wanted them to be. They had transformed into something dark, heads shaved, bodies covered in Nazi tattoos, fully immersed in the world of white supremacy. Their father, Dennis, had tried to control them, to discipline them, to force them back onto what he saw as the righteous path. But the boys hated him for it. They hated their mother for standing by him. And their little brother Eric? He was just collateral damage. They had been planning it for weeks. No more rules, no more punishments, no more being told what they could and couldn't do. The only way to be free was to eliminate their parents entirely. The night of February 26th, they put their plan into motion. The first blow came swiftly. Brian gripped an aluminum baseball bat and swung it with full force into his father's skull. The impact was sickening, a dull crack echoing through the house. Dennis staggered, blood already pouring down his face. He barely had time to understand what was happening before Brian struck again. Over and over. The blows were relentless, merciless, until their father was nothing more than a broken body on the floor. Brenda woke to the sound of her husband's dying groans. She barely had time to react before David, knife in hand, lunged at her. The blade plunged into her, tearing through flesh and muscle, the pain searing and unrelenting. She tried to scream, to fight, but there was no escape. She collapsed in a pool of her own blood, the life draining from her as her sons stood over her lifeless body. But there was still one more to go. Eric, just 11 years old, had heard the struggle. He had seen the horror unfold. His big brothers, the people he had trusted, were covered in blood, their eyes filled with something he had never seen before. He begged them to stop, pleaded for his life. "Please, no," he sobbed. "Please." There was no hesitation. Brian and David silenced him the same way they had silenced their parents. When it was over, the house was dead. Silent. They didn't panic. They cleaned themselves up, packed their bags, and fled into the night. This was just the beginning. They had plans to leave Pennsylvania, to join a white supremacist group, to start a new life where no one could control them. They thought they had done everything right. They thought they had covered their tracks. They were wrong. When the police arrived the next morning, they were met with a scene of unimaginable brutality. Blood soaked the walls and floors. The bodies were left exactly where they had fallen, but the killers were missing. A massive manhunt began. Their faces were plastered across every news station, their cold, empty stares seared into the public's mind. They thought they were smart, that they could outmaneuver the police. But within 3 days, they were caught, hiding in a stolen car parked outside the home of a known white supremacist. In the interrogation room, Brian was calm, almost proud of what they had done. He admitted they had talked about killing their parents for months, that it was the only way to be free. David, quieter but no less dangerous, simply muttered, "They had it coming." There was no trial. They pleaded guilty, avoiding the death penalty, but were sentenced to life in prison without parole. No chance for freedom, no second chances. The house where the Freeman family had once lived was abandoned, left to decay. a ghostly reminder of what had happened. The town of Salisbury would never forget the night when two boys, driven by hate and rage, turned on their own family and made a pact in blood.